Hi, folks. We'll give it just a minute. It looks like we have a few people joining us. Good to see you today. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Angie's typing in the chat. Be sure to tell us where you're from today in the chat. And as we go along, we'll want to have you put in questions in there, and we will be able to answer them hopefully during the talk. If not, we'll certainly cover them at the end of the talk.
We'll wait just a little bit longer just to give everybody a chance. I know for me, when my calendar invite goes off, that's what reminds me to join a webinar. So we'll give everybody a minute to join in. Maybe we'll just wait 2 minutes past.
It's not my backyard, but James is apparently in my backyard. So oh, good. I'm with Dan this week. You may have noticed here. This is not an episode of our podcast. This is a webinar. But I like to come down and see the folks here in sunny Waterloo, Ontario, a few times a year, and this happens to be one of them. So instead of doing this remotely like we normally would do, we get to actually be together and talk over each other. So,
yes. Yeah. All right. Well, we're 2 minutes past, so maybe we'll get started now. So thanks everybody for joining. So today I have me. I'm Dan Siemon, CPO, and Jeremy.
Senior product. What is it? Senior product management. I almost said senior product officer.
It's been a long day already.
It's been a long day.
So today we're going to do a couple things. We're going to do a really brief overview of Preseem, kind of our philosophy to quality of experience and a bunch of the stuff that we do. This webinar is targeting people who don't know Preseem well. So we'll spend a little bit of time there, but we won't go in any crazy depth. Then after that, we're going to dive into the main topic, which is, of course, the automatic access point capacity management feature that we just launched. And really excited to explain what that is and what we're doing with that. So we're going to jump to the next slide, Jeremy. Agenda, a little bit of an overview, talk about the problem, talk about our approach, some results, and of course, we'll have time for discussion at the end as well. So with that, we'll kick it off. So Preseem, so we take a very expansive view of quality of experience. And what I mean by that is, for us, quality of experience and delivering a good experience to your customers is 80% having the tools and operating in a proactive manner to address problems before customers have them and to make sure the network is operating cleanly and has sufficient capacity. And then the last 20% of where you can't make those changes, where you can implement traffic management features to kind of mitigate problems that would otherwise occur. And this is kind of inverted to what many people view in this space, where people would call a solution which is pure traffic shaping QoE, and that's just not at all our definition. We're trying to take, and we do take a much more expansive view of that. So for us, we build tools that help the subscriber, help the access network operations team, helps the core network operations team, support team, and sales and marketing. And I'll talk about each of those just very briefly. But fundamentally, what we do is we have the ability to collect QoE metrics directly from the network, directly from the subscriber's traffic. We tie that back in with a whole bunch of information we collect directly from the network elements. We do this via the polar component. And all those two things together give us an enormous data pool to be able to drive and understand real-world network behavior. And we use that to build performance models. So we can understand what should a PMP 450M, or what is it actually capable of in the real world, not what the vendor marketing spec sheets say, which is usually a very different thing. And then we tie that back with the behavior of the local AP to be able to tell you where there's problems and give you the information of which access points, for example, have the worst RF, which ones have which CPEs, for example, have the worst RF conditions. And that's much more complicated than just looking at simple modulations. So we'll touch at each of these, but I think the main focus or the main message here is we rely a lot on data to answer these questions and giving our customers the tools to be proactive versus just being blunt, crushing traffic to try to make the network idle or less busy. So what do we do? So for subscribers, we help deliver a lower latency, more consistent experience for subscribers. And we do this through applying modern AQM techniques to the subscribers' traffic. And we often say throughput matters, but subscribers feel latency. And this is really true. Like if you have high latency, web browsing slow, everything just kind of feels slow. It doesn't feel interactive. And the way that we do the traffic management addresses that by providing isolation between the flows and maintaining very short queue depths. We have lots of talks in our channel on YouTube if you're interested in kind of what creates buffer bloat, what creates latency, and what we do about that. But the biggest thing there is with these techniques in place, the very common problem of self-congestion goes away. And by self-congestion, I mean someone who's hitting their plan rate, maybe with a big download, and it makes a Zoom call not work anymore. Those type of problems just simply don't exist when you manage traffic in this way. But delivering a good experience to the customers is more than just their actual internet service. It's support as well. So we give tools that help you avoid calls by, again, being proactive, addressing the problems before the customer's call. But then there's additional tools that help the support team be more productive. And of course, if the support team can get to the root cause faster, that's ultimately good for the subscriber as well.
And much cheaper for you.
And much cheaper than taking phone calls. Yeah, exactly. So for the Access Network Operations team, you may not have a team specifically called this. This is essentially the people that manage the access points. And some people have teams like this. Other people fold them in the network team, but this is the category that we call them. So we can easily do things like tell you which access points are delivering a poor experience or which APs have poor RF conditions. And I mentioned this just briefly, that's not as simple as modulation. That is time of day and stability. And what else all goes into that, Jeremy? All kinds of
many things.
Lots and
What's
lots.
normal for that particular type of AP?
Right. Yeah. How does that AP behave across all of our customers, and how is it comparing your instance of that AP against all those other ones? It takes a lot of data to do that, but we're able to roll that all up into simple scores that you can just sort and figure out which access points across all your vendors have the worst RF conditions and go address them.
Right.
CPEs. I mean, as a customer who has a low modulation, they're a heavy user, and they use it when everyone else uses it. Those are the people that are killing your airtime. And as a fixed wireless provider, Jeremy always says, you sell airtime and not bandwidth.
They might not even be a heavy user. It might just be that they have poor modulation and get on when everybody else
is on. Right. So the business value score that we have on individual CPE radios can identify those CPEs that you need to go fix to free up airtime, make more airtime available on that access point, so the customers get a better experience and you can sell more. And this is money, exactly. And this is an example of what I said at the beginning, where we're trying to focus more on how do we get the optimal capacity out of the network. The alternative approach here is, you could just like shape a bunch of traffic below the busy person anyway, but it doesn't end up in a good spot for the customer. So we focus heavily on how do you operationalize and make it easy to be proactive and get rid of this and solve these problems. Right. The one in the top right, I kind of went out of order here, you may have noticed, but the one in the top right is the subscriber capacity. And I saved that for the end because it's a really good example of what we can do with our data. Like when we have this behavioral model information and we have near real time information about the individual access points, we can turn that into really valuable metrics. Like how many subscribers can the access point have on it to deliver a good experience? Right. And this little bar here, or little gauge, we're showing that AP has 8 too many subscribers to deliver a good customer experience. And we'll talk about this again a little bit later. Go ahead.
Well, that fits into the previous point about helping you optimize how much network capacity you're allocating to each customer, because you could easily take an approach where you'd say, we are just simply going to invest more and more money to get closer and closer to the client and put in bigger and bigger antennas and not ever get to a point where you're making money. So we're actually helping you optimize the right amount of investiture there.
Yep. And that's what he's hinting at there is in that gauge, there's that little blue range. That blue range is kind of, you're busy enough that the AP is making money, but it's not so busy the customers are unhappy. And right. that's kind of what that's aiming for.
Green means go sell more.
Yeah,
there's money to be made.
Exactly. And again, just one example of the stuff that we're able to do with our data that goes much beyond the kind of simple traffic management definition of quality of experience. For the network operations team, we can operate as a single point of enforcement for all of your different vendors, all of your different access technologies, like any services that are delivered behind them. And the big benefit here is you can introduce new vendors into the network without having to build dedicated integrations for them. And of course, you get that kind of simple, common view across all the subscribers in whatever access technology or underlying vendor that they use. But what's also neat about this is all of the quality of experience metrics are taken at kind of the IP and transport layer. So it doesn't really matter what infrastructure is under us, but we can identify all kinds of interesting problems. I mean, the obvious things are like overloaded backhauls, overloaded APs, in-home Wi-Fi problems. But we also see really interesting things like if people have misconfigured bonded links and it's reordering packets, that shows up as retransmissions. Or if there's, every once in a while, we get a customer who's seeing really, really high packet loss. Turns out to be an overloaded microtik, for example. And because it's just measuring on the traffic level, it doesn't really matter what the underlying cause is. These all manifest themselves in a few very simple things like lost packets, high latency, lower throughput, and a few other QoE metrics that we can tie back to the topology and the area of the network. For the support team, I mentioned a little bit of these earlier, but we help the support team be able to understand if the problem is in the network, so in the ISP or in the subscriber. And this is really important because you don't want to have your support rep spend an hour on the phone debugging the throughput problem that turns out to be an overloaded access point.
Or poor Wi-Fi in the customer's home.
Well, or I isolated that as the initial problem, because if the AP is not busy and the throughput's low, then it probably is a problem inside the subscriber's home. You can also look at subscriber history, real time, and over longer periods of time to see what they're doing. Getting to root cause faster is really important as well. There's a little screenshot in the top corner there about some of the diagnostics. So we'll tell you on a given CPE radio that there's likely uplink interference or likely downlink interference. And what's neat about this is not only does it help make your L1 techs who aren't RF experts more productive, it also is a layer on top of all these different vendors where they don't have to learn to go into the individual vendor tools. So the screenshot in the bottom right corner shows Ubiquiti and some Cambium APs, but you'll notice that all the same scores are available across those vendors. So those, again, the L1, L2 techs that maybe don't even have access to the vendor tools can actually be productive and understand what's going on in the fixed wireless network. And of course, you still need the vendor tools for config. Like we don't do configuration. We have no intention of doing configuration, but this kind of like how to high level view of all these vendors kind of covered the 80% use cases is something that we're really spending a ton of time on. For the sales and marketing team. So we hear from many providers that within the ISP, there's often, let's call them arguments or disagreements on where there is capacity and where they should be selling. And the subscriber capacity number that I mentioned earlier is an empirical data-based approach to reducing that tension, right? Like it's that number is going to tell both sides of the organization what that access point can handle. The engineering team can use that to identify APs that need to be upgraded if it doesn't have any capacity left or maybe split. But the marketing team can take that information and do things like identify a particular site that has a whole bunch of available capacity. And if they go market in that area, those are the cheapest customers you're ever going to get because they already have capacity, right? No new capital expenditure, for example. So that's really important and really powerful for the sales and marketing team. And we are working, a little coming soon bullet here. We are working on plan assurance, which is kind of like the next level up of this, where it's not just the kind of typical subscriber behavior that we can tell you for the AP, but how many gold plans you could sell on that AP, or how many bronze plans, or how many too many bronze plans you've sold on the EP, for example. So that's something we're working on. And again, really comes out of this heavy data-based analytical approach, again, versus traffic management. So with that, we'll move on to what we're actually here for, which is to talk about automatic AP capacity management. We'll talk a little bit about the problem set that we're trying to solve here, and then Jeremy's going to go into a whole bunch of detail on the approach we've taken and how it works, and you can get some screenshots of how to actually operate it in your network as well. So fundamentally, the problem we're trying to solve here is an overloaded link. It's obviously much simpler when it's a nice, controlled, guided medium versus wireless, but fundamentally, the problems are exactly the same. As link utilization goes up, which is in these two little charts that's moving to the right, you often see a situation where latency suddenly goes up really fast and good put suddenly goes down really fast. Good put is basically a measure of how much useful throughput goes through the access point versus total throughput.
So like discounting retransmissions.
Yeah.
Because as loss rises, retransmissions rise, which reduces the total
exactly
effective payload, the good put.
Yeah, that's right. So you've probably all experienced this, where you've got a link that's at 90%. People are relatively happy. It goes to 95 and like the world is ending and no one's happy. And this is fundamentally a problem of these packet queues are filling up. They're not managed properly. As the queues fill up, latency goes up. Eventually they fill up enough, packets have to be dropped. And both of those things are what cause a poor customer experience. So in terms of the self-congestion, we addressed this with our QoE optimized plan enforcement, which is pretty much like the first thing we did like 4 or 5 years ago now. But this can also happen on the access point level. And we've had tools for a long time to identify this, because our latency measurements tied to the topology very clearly show you which APs are delivering a bad experience. And now this is another feature that we're rolling out to manage that better. We have had manual access point shapers for a long time, 3 years, 2 or 3 years. It's been quite a while. And essentially what this is you just go to an individual access point, you type in the rates, like you can see what's its throughput, you type in a rate based on kind of where you think its cutoff is, and then you can modulate that yourself manually to achieve a good latency and a good subscriber experience. We have some customers that are very religious about this. They do this for every single access point and continually update it because they're really, really, really focused on having the best values there and the best QoE. But other customers use it a little bit more as like a pain mitigation tool. So you have one particular access point that is heavily overloaded and you go set a shaper on it until you can upgrade it and make it better. And fundamentally, that's just because they're manual. It is very, smaller networks, it's obviously easier to do this for every AP than it is on really, really large networks. And as you might have guessed by the name of what we're talking about today, we've built a new thing now to make this automatic. But before we get there, there's another philosophical thing that we'll maybe touch on a little bit is we're very focused, again, I mentioned at the beginning, about adding capacity to the network to deliver a good experience and not artificially reducing it. And by that, just to be blunt, I mean things like application-specific shaping. This is something that our team has very extensive experience in, 10 years and more back. I decided we don't want to do it again for a whole bunch of different reasons. And I mean, in a way, it's kind of an obvious approach because you think if you limit a bunch of applications, eventually you get below the point the network's busy, and then an idle network almost always delivers a good experience. But that's kind of, jokingly, it's kind of like saying water's wet. Like, of course, that's true. If you reduce demand to the point the network's not busy, the experience in pure, like simple metrics like latency is going to be a little better. But in the metrics that are harder to measure, that's not true, which is the things like that your customer cares about, ultimately like throughput on a per application basis. So some problems with this is it really doesn't address the real problem. The real problem is the AP has fundamental limits. The problem is not individual applications. Even beyond that, how do you choose which applications? Sometimes people will give examples of, well, they want to limit game updates to make them low priority. Well, a game update to a kid who just got home at 4 o'clock after school is not low priority traffic. That's the most important thing in the world to them. And it's just fundamentally not possible to make that decision in a way that makes all subscribers happy. Even more than that, it really makes the service less competitive with other access technologies. Cable, fiber, they stopped doing this stuff 10 years ago. It's just not necessary anymore. And fundamentally, we just need to manage the point, the real fundamental limit, which is the access point, and not play games with trying to make decisions for individual subscribers. It's a little philosophical, but something that we really, really feel very, very strongly about, and spend a lot of time building our whole platform and our whole philosophy on working on the capacity side around this idea that this is just not a long-term solution. Right. It's a race to the bottom, really, because you can always limit more traffic to get a more idle network. It just isn't, it doesn't align the ISP with their subscriber. And I don't know of any business where you can not do what your customers want for a long time and be successful. It just doesn't, it puts the ISP in tension with their customers.
Right. You might be able to do that temporarily, but over time, traffic is going to grow 70 to 20% per year. And if you aren't planning for that, your customers will go to someone who will provide that.
Who is? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so before I go there, so we wanted to do something better. We wanted to really use our data that we have to understand the real problem, which is the AP congestion, and manage that, not proxy manage it through managing something else that's happening in the network. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jeremy to explain what we've built.
The easy button. You've even given me a graphic, Dan. Yeah. That's great. So what we've done, in the old world where you were manually setting a cap or a limit on what the access point could do, you had to use your, kind of spidey sense or innate knowledge, looking at the graphs and saying, well, I can clearly see that when it rises over a certain point here on this particular access point, that latency is going to rise and the consumer experience, the subscriber experience is going to drop. So we essentially figured out how to automate this process. We take a number of different inputs into this algorithm. One would be understanding that network topology. So we need to know what access point is the subscriber attached to, and what are the services that are downstream from that CPE, and then we also need to understand the AP performance and the RF conditions. So by performance, I mean, are we dealing with an access point where everyone is at a high modulation, or are we at an access point where some of the subscribers are having a poor modulation, or maybe all of them are? There's always going to be some day-to-day fluctuation as different subscribers use data. And then the last tier of this is the real-world performance that Dan mentioned. When he talks about the data that we've collected, we collect trillions of metrics a day, and so for any given technology, we can go analyze tens of millions of latency samples to determine what's the actual optimal rate that we should be sending through this access point, and we can automate that. We have many hundreds of providers worldwide, and that gives us a lot of data to be able to determine what's best for that access point. We might not be able to determine what's best for that access point 99.99% of the time, but we might be able to do high 80s or 90s to be able to determine exactly what's best for that access point, which is pretty good given the just the natural variability that there is in something as chaotic as RF. So we're taking those RF conditions into account, and we're trying to determine, is this a temporary anomaly, or is this something that long term is indicating a trend about what that access point is doing? So when we then take that data, kind of roll it into a ball, and use that to create an automatic repeated adjustment of the traffic rate on the access point, it will adapt to these changing conditions. That means that you're going to consistently have great QoE even when the access point is busy. It's going to keep your subscribers happy, and it's going to dramatically reduce the amount of labor that you're putting into that process. So that's going to lower your operational costs. That's why we're calling it an easy button. And I'll show you just a few charts. I'm not to show you too many, but as Dan mentioned previously, when the access point is idle, you're really not expecting that QoE would be poor. There's no need to do anything when you have plenty of airtime.
It's like an idle backhaul link.
Or it's an open road. You can drive fast on the open road, right? It's not rush hour. So looking at these three traces here, I'm showing you the x-axis here along the horizontal is the percentile of latency samples. So in the Preseem's UI, generally you're just looking at 1 percentile, the 80th percentile line, but that means that there's going to be 20% of packets that are going to have a higher latency than that line. So what we look at in detail for this process is let's look at the very worst samples. Those are these ones that are going to be over here on the right. I'll kind of highlight them here for you. These samples here are the ones that are going to be, in general, the worst samples, right? Some of those are going to be due to RF conditions in the home with their home Wi-Fi or other conditions. So looking at these three traces, if we look at the idle trace, notice that this blue one here, when the AP is under 50% load, we are producing some improvement. So in this case, down is better because that means we're reducing the latency. We're sending that packet faster. And that means that we do see some improvement for essentially all packets here, even when the AP is a little idle. It's not a dramatic. It's like 5 to 15 milliseconds of improvement kind of across the board there. In the case of this yellow line, when the AP is under kind of a moderate load, beginning to be saturated, that's 50 to 75% of airtime. Notice the results are more dramatic. We're kind of seeing between 5 and then in some cases all the way up to 25 milliseconds of improvement. That's actually really good. And the most dramatic results are when that AP is slammed. If that AP is over 75% of airtime consumed, that's what we're showing here with this line. Notice across the board, at least 10 milliseconds of improvement, which might be 20% of your total. It could easily be if you're running 50 to 100 milliseconds baseline. And then in the case of the 95th percentile here, we're seeing up to, kind of an average of 25 milliseconds. That means somewhere between 20 and 40 milliseconds of improvement. Now, the very worst samples, these ones here, we can't improve those, but that's because those are due to circumstances that are beyond the AP congestion problem that Dan described. That's going to be due to congestion in the home or packet loss within the home. So a certain percentage of those packets we're not going to improve with any technology. Just depends on how we measure it to say, no, we're going to actually show you all these samples here. So let me go on to the next slide. Any questions about that one, Dan?
Nope.
Okay. And in this case, we're looking specifically at the peak busy hours, not just the hours when the AP is idle. Again, we know network performance is going to be good there. So what we are attempting to do is optimize that access point for those evening hours, those peak busy hours where the AP is under the greatest load. Those are the conditions that we need to prepare for. And consequently, we're looking at those, kind of call them the worst hours of the day. And those are the ones that we're using to create this automatic shaper that can control for those conditions. And as that changes from day to day, the shaper can change as well. I'm going to show you a few more graphs of our trial phase, which started in January. So we've been running this thing for quite a while now. We've got a lot of really good data on this. And this one you can see, this is, let me change my color here so we can get a little, here, I'll do a little magenta here. So this part was before the shaper was applied, and then this part is after the shaper was applied. And as you can see, it reduced latency a good bit. I want to say, I didn't run the numbers on this precisely, but probably this 80th percentile dropped at least 10 milliseconds, probably more than that, probably closer to 15 or 20. But the important thing I want to show you about this is we really didn't kill these peaks. If we, as Dan said, we could just keep pushing the amount of traffic lower and lower, and latency would continue to improve. We don't want to do that. We want to balance the needs of the customer to actually get data and the needs of the end user to, the needs of the operator to keep that latency at a good level. So we noticed we did very little. It looks like we had a couple spikes here. This would be over Christmas, as expected. Those are like the busiest times of the year. So we really just shaved a little bit off here from what that peak was at Christmas. And, when we came in early January, and automatically kept that to a really good level. So we were able to improve performance and not drop the throughput very much. Same thing here with this example. Again, you'll see some latency spikes here. This one's even clearer. These examples are not cherry picked for like an idle access point. These are some of the busiest access points in this provider. Notice that we had some fairly high latency spikes there. Again, kind of the worst over Christmas. And you'll note that this drop is due to the shaper, not due to traffic falling off. Because notice traffic did not fall off here after Christmas. The demand was greater during Christmas, but this AP was already loaded. All that happened when that demand increased is latency rose. So with the shaper in place, notice we're able to drop this latency, kind of that average latency, considerably, and still keep throughput high. And this is another one, same thing. Notice that you'll see in this case, you could kind of see the average about there. It looks like we dropped the average latency maybe 15 to 20 milliseconds here after that trial started. And again, we were able to keep throughput really high. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I didn't think I was going to do this one, but I guess I am. We build a statistical model, figure out what the loaded rate is for that AP, make a prediction for the next 24 hours. Even though that's going to fluctuate from day to day, there's going to be some kind of natural noise or error on either side of that link rate over time. That's going to be much more accurate than something that you can do by hand. And
the millions of samples, just to touch on, we touched on it earlier, that this is based on what we collect for a given AP model across all of our customers. Right. So we see many, many thousands of pretty much every access point. And we get
sometimes tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands of instances of given access point models. And it's really powerful when you can see how they behave across so many different RF and deployment models and conditions to be able to understand what's really possible for that hardware.
Exactly. And similarly, I mentioned this here that we can find the link rates when that access point is actually under load. And this is true for a number of different, no vendor is free from, what the AP reports in terms of link rate or what's achievable is always an estimate, because you don't actually know until you push data through it and transmit to that customer and find out what modulation rate that customer can actually receive. That's when you find out what the real rate is. So we look at the rates of when the AP is under load. We don't look at the average rates of when the AP is idle. That would be very misleading. We look at the real rates when the AP is under load. And sometimes that will produce lower rates than you think because you're seeing maybe some spikes or peaks at other times of the day. Again, our goal here is to balance the needs of latency and throughput. So we have a new view for this. For those of you who've seen some of our metric charts before, previously the shaper would have just been a straight line across. Now, if it was a manual shaper, it would have just been a straight line. Now you'll see this dotted line here going up and down as this AP is changing under changing conditions. We calculate these once a day and set them. There's no need to set them more often than that. And again, because we want to look at the entire peak busy hour period, we're going to use a full 24 hours to make a prediction from. Notice that in this case, the shaper was up about here. And notice we have some latency spikes here over the next few days. And the shaper automatically adjusted to this and eventually got down to here, zoop. And notice our latency is now holding steady just a little bit over baseline at peak busy hour. You might wonder, we say, well, that seems like a dramatic difference from this peak that we saw on the 8th down to the 11th. Well, here's why. It's because when that AP was under load, here we are looking at the link rates. Notice that for these, you see these dark periods here are the kind of the busy hours. Look how low this rate is. This is the actual achievable link rate during the busy hour compared to when it's at idle.
Maybe you could talk about that for a second, because I think if people haven't thought too much about modulations and individual subscribers, it may be hard to understand why the capacity of the AP changes at different times of the day. Like, this isn't like a storm.
No, this isn't a storm. This is just normal usage. It's because the subscribers on even the best managed of APs, they're likely to have at least some clients which have lower rates than other clients. And if those clients are the ones that happen to use a lot of data, as was the case here, starting after the 7th, you can really see it. You can see it kick up very dramatically. The 7th being on the left-hand side of this chart. For whatever reason, the clients that maybe they were downloading, maybe somebody came to visit and they're running an extra TV in the home. That's kind of a common thing. Or somebody comes home for spring break and comes home for the summer, and usage patterns change within the home. That's the beauty of a system like this, is it's going to automatically adapt to whatever the changing conditions are on that access point. You'll still need to be, watching how your customers, as Dan talked about with those scores, making sure that you're preserving the value in your network, but at least you're going to have a little bit more of a performance cushion before you really need to go do additional things to free up capacity on that.
Yeah, for me, is kind of like an RF dabbler versus an RF expert. Seeing that metric isn't specific to the auto AP capacity. That's a metric we've had for a while now, but seeing how much the effective throughput changes based on modulations and subscriber behavior was really enlightening. And that's a very powerful metric there that can really help you understand why the performance during peak is not what you think it is, because it can just be dramatically different than during the rest of the day.
Yeah, that experience is nonlinear. So you can absolutely have a customer that you say, well, they've got 50% of whatever the maximum link rate is. That should be fine. Well, yes, but if they use the same amount of data as somebody else, they're consuming double the airtime, and often the discrepancy is greater than that.
And maybe just before we leave that, we published an RF ebook back maybe 3-4 weeks ago, which really explains this relationship of modulations and airtime and what that means. And that's just a free download on our website if you're interested at all. It's like a 6-page PDF or 10-page PDF or something like that. And yeah, just if you're interested, really, really interesting stuff.
Thanks. Something I wrote a couple of years ago.
Jeremy wrote
good stuff. I would say that. So enabling this feature in Preseem is really not too difficult. Step 1 of 3. You go to access point shaper and you just say, enable all auto shapers, like that. All right. And you get a warning. But then step 2, well, there is no step 2. It's actually really that easy. We do have an additional control for if you're dealing with new access points that don't exist yet. You can decide whether you want new ones to automatically be shaped this way or what. Oh, thanks. Angie's posted a link to the ebook in the general chat there if anybody wants to download that. It's free download. And then we also have a list where you can see, not only I can see here, for example, this access point, it has some rates that are ready to go, but notice you'll see no checkboxes here. It hasn't been turned on for that access point yet. And we can drill down right into that access point and decide what we want to do. We can turn on auto shaping, or we can turn on manual shaping. We can override it. You can have manual shaping without automatic shaping if you want. That's what mimics the older behavior that Dan talked about that we built a number of years ago. So kind of the world's your oyster there. It's pretty easy feature to use. It's pretty simple.
Yeah. We really did try, like the easy button's obviously a joke, but we really did try pretty hard to make it as dead simple as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, a couple discussion points. Anything before we go to that, Dan?
No.
Okay. And now is also the time to start thinking of your questions and getting them in the chat here. So first question a lot of people want to know is, if you are already a Preseem customer or you're thinking about becoming a Preseem customer, you want to know, what does this feature cost me? Well, I'm very pleased to announce that this does not cost anything extra. This is part of the base tier, what we call Preseem Essentials. and that is available to everyone who has Preseem Essentials. As of the release will be sometime this week. We already have a good number of companies,
25 or
probably 25 or 30, yeah,
it.
30, yeah, probably 30 companies already using it, with really good feedback on that. So it's pretty well tested at this point. It's our first alpha customers were in our alpha testers, I should say, were right. I think it was January 3rd was when we started. So we've been working on this one for a while and just wanting to make sure it's really polished for you. Angie's pointed out questions are going to go to the Q&A tab, so don't worry if they disappear from the public chat. They're going to be over in Q&A, and we'll deal with them as they come on. So then, secondly, we have this about flexible framing. So about 50% of access points across the WISP world are generally running in flexible framing, where you are not setting a specific ratio of download to upload. In fixed framing, you're saying, okay, I want 75% of my download it to be download and 25% to be upload, or some other ratio. Sometimes it's pretty flexible about where that divide goes, and then the access point is allocating a certain amount of airtime for that. For something like a radio that has this GPS sync, you can synchronize all the radios in an area with fixed framing and make sure that they don't talk over one another, where you have an upload and download occurring at the same time and causing kind of self-interference. Flexible framing, if you apply shapers to it, that will turn it into a sort of virtual fixed framing, because now you're saying, here's how much we want to allocate to download and here's how much we want to allocate to upload. We are going ahead and allowing you to use this auto feature for flexible framing. It might not align with your business goals in terms of how much actual traffic you want to allow. Like maybe you're willing to allow the speed test to be higher at another time of day and then be more constrained during peak busy hour. So it's in testing. As I said, people are happy with it so far. It does work, but it might not match the reasons that you are using flexible framing. If you're using flexible framing to say dramatically increase the total amount of download that you have available at the expense of upload, then, or I should say at the expense of guaranteed upload speeds, then this might not align with your business needs. But you can make that decision on basically on a per access point basis. So you can definitely try it out. If you're running flexible framing today, you can try it out. And we have a couple enhancements as well that are coming to the flexible framing algorithm that will be rolling in after release as well. So this is a kind of feature that we can continually improve as we get more people using it, because now we have more data into that model that Dan described. And then similarly, I said to you before, auto shaping can expose RF problems where we say, well, the average rate on that access point looks great, but then during busy times, that rate might be dropping. And you'll want to find out why that is. So anytime that RF performance is worse than expected, it's really helpful if you can take a deeper look at that. And we have some kind of alerts and errors in the UI, even if you're on the Essentials tier, to help you dig into that a bit more. If you're using Plus, you'll have really detailed information.
Right. There was one customer that's been using it now for a little bit, and they had a 450M where the shaping algorithm determined a lower rate than they were expecting. And when they went to look at it, and Jeremy dug into it with them, it was a few really, really bad clients on that AP were really dragging that effective rate way, way, way down. So it actually, even without the shaping, it taught them something they didn't otherwise know.
Correct. Yeah. Okay, and we've already handled flexible versus fixed. I put that bullet point in there twice. So sorry, guys. It is just an important one to know. Yeah. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the context of what James is dealing. And James has a question here coming up. Okay, so I'm going to start answering these questions here in the Q&A tab. James is asking, will we be able to include or exclude large batches? So currently there's no like bulk operator where you can say, I want to just turn it on for my cambiums or just turn it on for the ubiquities. For example, if you're in a mixed network, or maybe just turn it on for fixed framing and leave it off for flexible. Unfortunately, James, we don't yet have a bulk operator that you can just pass a batch to. However, it is pretty quick to turn things on or off and make decisions about it. So I hope that doesn't become too much of a burden to you in the interim. It's faster than what we had before. So we would like to do kind of a more bulk tool that you're describing, James, where you'd be able to kind of filter the list and make some decisions on that basis. Right now, what we've been recommending is if you're wanting to test it out, kind of exclude batches, is just turn it on for some of the busy ones that you've got and see if you like it, see if it's helping you out. And if it isn't helping you out, please let us know, because we want to be able to make it so that it can as I said, we can't help in 100% of the cases, but what we have proven in the trials is that we can avoid doing harm. So even in cases where like we would back off and say, well, if we're unsure if this is going to be a help to this access point, then let's just be conservative and let's back off and at least do no harm. And in those cases, what you find is that microbursts are still helped by this. You want to talk about microbursts a little bit, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, microburst just means something that's small enough that you can't otherwise see it. It maybe gets lost in the averages, but it still impacts the overall quality of experience. So having a kind of a stricter limit upstream just makes those go away, because you get like a flat bandwidth towards the AP versus the very kind of bursty thing that can happen without that in place. So even shaving off really, really short bursts can be a good benefit for the subscriber experience.
Josh has got a couple questions, and let's take that second one first. He's basically saying if you enable it for all, is the way to block it on a few select APs. Yeah. Yes, just go turn it off on those APs that you don't want to have included in that. Yeah. That's a similar question to what the previous questioner was asking. Sure, it is we call it like a destructive action to turn it on, to turn auto on for all of them. However, only destructive in the sense that there's no undo. You can turn them back off if necessary. It's not going to, in a perfect world, the customers would not notice like immediately if you mess something up on that. If you were to manually go in and make a change that didn't make sense, like cut the bandwidth of the AP in half, maybe they would notice in that case, although latency would still be good, as Dan was describing. So there's not a way to block it, but you can absolutely turn it off quite quickly for a few APs, Josh. And then Josh, there's another question, which I'm going to let Dan take.
Yeah. So this one, I hinted at this a little bit earlier. So the question is basically asking about DPI and other traffic optimization. So I'll be a little careful here that I don't go into full passion/rant mode on this too much. But we have our team has a ton of experience with big DPI deployments. There's so many edge cases involved in that. We don't have any intention of doing that for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Fundamentally, it sets up the ISP to be in conflict with their subscribers, because you're making decisions on their behalf that aren't necessary for a good experience. And like the example I gave, if somebody buys a 50 meg plan, they're not happy. They will not be happy if they're limited to 15 meg for Netflix or something like that. Like that's just fundamentally sets up that point of conflict. But even more importantly, it's just not necessary. Like the cable guys, the fiber guys, they all stopped doing this stuff ages ago. It's not necessary to deliver a good experience. On the optimization side, I assume that's referring to TCP optimization.
It mentions acceleration.
Acceleration. So,
and specifically, like when there's no congestion, what are we doing to enhance the flow?
So I'll come back to that, because that actually is something that we definitely help with. On the optimization side, what that really is a TCP proxy, right? A TCP optimizer is a nice way of saying TCP proxy. And there is too much important traffic in the network today to be relying on a TCP proxy to deliver a good experience.
Too much traffic that's not TCP.
Too much traffic that's not TCP. So Facebook, YouTube, there's rumors that Netflix is going to switch to Quick soon. If the network relies on a TCP proxy to deliver a good experience, it is giving a bad experience to those other protocols. It's just full stop.
You can't create new bandwidth. You can only reduce it from certain packets.
It's just that simple. And I know people will counter and say, well, there's still 75% of traffic's TCP. But how do you explain to a customer why the thing they care about is not working, but the speed test is fine because it happens to be a TCP flow that's accelerated? Like, it just makes no sense to add a TCP proxy to a network in 2023. And
geosynchronous orbit, I will grant you.
Sure.
If you have really, really high latency.
Yeah.
But our goal is to help you get the latency of your access layer, even before you've turned shaping on. Get that down to the point where the shaping is just the icing on the cake. You don't even need proxying, and proxying can be actually harmful.
Yeah, and there's lots of downsides to a proxy too. You can't have any traffic that routes around it because all the TCP connections have to die. It's necessary with a proxy. So you can tell I get a little excited about this because this is something that really it drives. Like
you had some experience in this.
Yeah, we've got a lot of experience in this from past lives, like Preseem, and it's just these things don't make sense to do, and it just sets up a lot of unnecessary complexity. And that the accelerator thing especially is, I don't know how you can debug a network that behaves differently based on different transport protocols. Like, how do you even communicate that to a customer?
Right.
Why their YouTube's buffering because it doesn't happen to use TCP? Like it's just in my view, just a really, really bad idea. Now, in terms of making all the flows better, absolutely, because within each subscriber, we're providing flow isolation for all the flows that are within that subscriber's envelope. And then with the AP shaper in place, all the subscribers are getting a fair crack at the bandwidth of the AP as well. And again, staying below that point where they buffer a lot. So that does have huge benefits to this overall subscriber experience, just by the nature of things like UDP, like a DNS lookup, for example, that's a very short. It gets to the front of the line. It gets transmitted first. And those things have an outsized impact on experience.
Right.
And you don't need to have application aware and try to figure
TCP
out which
acceleration isn't going to help that at all.
Yeah, and you don't. Yeah, well, that's a good point too. But you don't need to know the application to make all this stuff way, way, way better.
Right.
We have, if anyone wants to have a much more detailed conversation about this, I'd be happy to have that separately. You can tell it's something that gets me a little excited. But
didn't we do a webinar on this?
And we did do a webinar a little while back that talked about how and why the internet is moving from TCP to UDP, and that's especially true. Maybe people don't know, is HTTP 3 is built on QUIC, which is UDP.
Yep.
So the whole web is moving to UDP
moving to
too,
UDP.
right? This isn't a trend that's going to stop. This is a trend that's going to accelerate. And again, repeating myself a little, it makes no sense to build a network that behaves differently on different transport protocols
for today.
In 2023. Yeah. Go back 10, 15 years. Sure. But this is not the world that we live in today.
It was a dead end as a technique.
Yeah.
And some of the biggest companies in the US, like Comcast, did it, and it turned out to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, the cable guys, they gave up on doing application-specific stuff a long time ago.
So then another point about that, when you're asking, like, is there something that can just be a default, always improve things? When we were talking about having AP shaping on this, in this example here, I'm showing an example where all of the subscribers that were part of the test had per subscriber shaping turned on. So they all had per flow fairness.
So that was already good.
That was already good, or as good as it could be, given the RF conditions and whatever's going on in the home Wi-Fi. And this comparison is the amount of improvement that we saw by turning on access point shaping, auto AP shaping for subscribers that were on the same backhauls. So the same ISPs, same backhauls, same general area of customers. So same kind of user behavior, same demographics, essentially. So for us to see any improvement at all on the baseline, it was actually a surprise to me. I didn't think that we would see any improvement when the AP is idle, under 50%. We attribute most of that improvement to again, microburst protection, where all of a sudden you get a little burst of packets that are coming at a really high speed from the servers on the internet with a 100 gig connection and coming in then over your ISP pipe. And all of those packets arriving at once, they're coming to multiple customers on that AP. The ability to buffer those just a little bit and improve them now against each other, essentially subscriber versus subscriber, actually did produce kind of in the worst case here, the 95th to 100th percentile. Notice that we are seeing some improvement there, 10 to 15, or let's go down the curve a little bit, 5 to 15 milliseconds, which is really nothing to sneeze at. Now, most of the time, remember, most of the time the AP is going to be idle. So the amount of difference that you see is going to be small in terms of like the total number of packets. Where you really care about it is when that AP is busy and you're passing a lot of packets. And in that case, absolutely, we see even more. That's where we see the most dramatic improvement. APs that have very few customers on them or at idle, I would be shocked if you see a dramatic change in the latency metrics. You shouldn't see a dramatic change if it was already running well, right? It's not like TCP proxying where you break that connection in two, and now all of a sudden the part of the network that doesn't reach all the way down to the end customer looks really good. Well, of course it's going to look good. You're not actually measuring the same thing as you were measuring before. So I don't think there's an additional test from any additional questions from Josh. Maybe we can get back to you.
I can comment just a little bit on that. So you should be able to achieve a very good an A+ rating, like with the QoE optimized stuff, like the FQ model things that we apply as well. If you're seeing any better with application aware stuff, I mean, maybe it's like absolutely giving priority over all traffic to the speed test. And again, that's something that we don't really want to do because we feel that it gives an unrealistic picture of the network. So But outside of that, like we have lots of customers that get excellent buffer bloat ratings, like latency under load ratings. And the AP shaper really does help with that a lot, because sometimes even if the subscriber's not self-congesting for very short periods of time, the AP was. Right. So as long as we can stay below the AP, now both of those most common points of congestion are being properly managed, and that makes that even better.
Right. So. And in this case where Josh is saying, you know, we can get an A+ rating all the time. Absolutely. If you clamp down harder on that traffic, then you're going to be able to get a better rating. That's just a guarantee, at the expense of throughput, of course. And so what we're trying to do is balance throughput and call it that buffer bloat rating. We don't want you to be in a world where you are always passing the buffer bloat rating with flying colors, because that means you aren't delivering enough, probably not delivering enough bits to your customers. Or
potentially not.
Right? We want you to be able to add more customers to access points that aren't fully loaded. So we feel like there's a sweet spot there where the customer is just not going to notice the speed of their customer because they have, and not the speed of the connection, because they have no reason to go speed test it. It's feeling fast all the time. That's our goal. You're welcome, Josh. Okay, it is 2:51. We only have about 10 minutes left, so get your questions in now if you have any remaining ones. It looks like everybody's stuck with us, so thank you for listening to two nerds chat here. We were joking that we need to get like two ferns and be like, you know, between two ferns with Dan and Jeremy. But I'm working on my Zach Galifianakis beard a little bit here. So, anything else? Get your questions in, guys. Okay, those are the already answered ones. Just give it just a minute. I don't know if anybody's typing. Do you have any way to say that? If you have any questions, again, we've got some interesting YouTube videos, and many of them, especially the ones that are kind of labeled technical webinar, they're not very Preseem-y. Like, of course, we're talking a little bit about our stuff, but there's a lot of just things there of like, how does Netflix actually work on the wire? You know, it's a chunk download protocol. It's not a streaming protocol. Why is the internet moving to UDP based instead of TCP? And what were the reasons and motivations behind it? All those kind of things are there. And we try pretty hard to not have too much Preseem-y stuff in those technical webinars. There necessarily ends up being a little bit of mostly kind of our philosophy and stuff on it, but hopefully you'd find those interesting from a purely technical standpoint, if nothing else. And hopefully a bunch of people downloaded the ebook. That's really good stuff. Right. If you manage a fixed wireless network, you need to read that ebook. Thanks, guys, for hanging out with us. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Anything else? Thank you. Nope.
All right.
Great. Thanks.